The House of Romanov was the second and last dynasty to rule Russia. It began with the reign of Mikhail Romanov in 1613, ending more than 3 centuries later in the bloody incidents of the Revolution of 1917. The Romanovs were always shrouded in intrigue and rumor. The details of the murder of Russia's royal family remain current even a century after their deaths. As one British historian would say, this is truly a family saga. The origins of the Romanovs is linked to 12 other noble Russian families, whose common ancestor is Andrei Kobyla, a boyar in service of Simon I of Russia. Later generations associated Kobyla with an illustrious pedigree. Initially, he was said to have arrived in Moscow in 1341 from Prussia, where his father was a famous rebel. At the end of the 17th century, a fictitious genealogical line was published, according to which his origin went back to Julius Caesar, dictator and general of the Roman Empire. Andrei Kobyla's origins are believed to have been less noble, not only because Kobyla is the Russian word for mare, but because his relatives had surnames related to horses and other domestic animals, indicating that they were descendants of royal knights. Over the years, the Romanovs grew and increased their power, reaching the headship of Russia during the 16th century. The Romanov dynasty was the result of a marriage in 1547. The bride was Anastasia, daughter of the Romanovs, a good family of the Moscow nobility. The groom was the 17-year-old Muscovite prince Ivan IV, who had proclaimed himself Tsar of Russia. Ivan IV, who became known as Ivan the Terrible, belonged to the Rurik dynasty. He was the first ruler crowned as Tsar, a title adopted by his grandfather, Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow who defeated the Mongols in 1480. After the Islamic Ottomans brought about the fall of Byzantium, he assumed the position of leader of orthodoxy by marrying the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. The union allowed him to present himself as heir to the Roman emperors, hence the title Caesar, which took the Russian form Tsar. Ivan increased the prosperity of his kingdom by marching into South Asia on an Orthodox Christian crusade to defeat Islamic Tartars, descendants of Genghis Khan. He triumphantly faced internal rebellions and betrayals brought on by feisty behavior. He had 8 wives, 3 poisoned, and others murdered on his orders, and several children. Anastasia Romanov was his first wife and his favorite. Ivan's technique for getting a wife was remarkable. He ordered 2,000 girls to line up to be inspected by him. He chose Anastasia. But Ivan fell deeply in love with his young wife. When she died 10 years later, he suspected that she had been poisoned. His grief turned into anger and perhaps to madness. His reign became progressively cruel, and he became known as Ivan the Terrible. He always carried an iron crozier with which he impaled the courtiers who annoyed him. When Novgorod rioted, Ivan besieged the city and sat for 5 weeks on an open-air throne, while 60,000 people were tortured and killed before his eyes. Torn between good and evil, Ivan always talked about abdicating the throne. He left Moscow in the middle of his reign and went to a monastery, where he participated in boisterous orgies, bloody executions, and felt abject remorse. Then he returned to the throne and, in a fit of rage, stabbed his eldest and favorite son. When the young man died, Ivan tried to atone for his guilt by reading the Bible and praying non-stop. He cried, saying that his life had been ruined by the death of his beloved Anastasia Romanova. At the end of his life, he was a person haunted by his victims. His hair fell out, and he screeched every night. When he died, supposedly during a chess game with the courtier Boris Godunov, his last gesture was to ask to become a monk. Ivan was succeeded by his father Fyodor, someone very weak. He was eventually replaced by the regent Boris Godunov, who ruled as Tsar for 5 years. His death gave rise to a horde of suitors and candidates for the throne. In Russian history, this period is known as the Time of Troubles. The throne was eventually claimed by a son of the King of Poland. A Polish army occupied Moscow, entrenching itself in the Kremlin and burning the rest of the city. Besieged by the Russians, the Poles occupied the Kremlin for 18 months and only escaped starvation by devouring their own dead. In November 1612, the Kremlin surrendered. Russia, which had not had a monarch for 3 years, called a national assembly to elect a new Tsar. The choice was another boy, 16-year-old Michael Romanov. His claim was weak from the point of view of royal blood. He was only the nephew of Ivan the Terrible, but he was the only candidate accepted by the noble factions. On a cold and windy day, March the 13th, 1613, a delegation of nobles, clergymen, aristocrats, merchants, artisans, and peasants, representing all the classes and towns of Russia, arrived at Kostroma on the upper Volga, communicating to Michael that he had been elected Tsar. His mother objected, arguing that all previous Tsars had had disloyal subjects. The delegates admitted that this was true, but were punished and came to an agreement in all the cities. Thrilled, Michael accepted. On July the 11th, 1613, he was crowned as the first Romanov in the Kremlin. The young Tsar managed to maintain harmony and social cohesion in his 3-decade reign. His personal qualities contributed to the success of his rule, and he is remembered as delicate and gentle. These characteristics helped him consolidate Tsarist authority. Still, for most of his rule, Michael was not the only authority. As he ascended the throne, his mother Martha placed herself at the head. His father, Filaret, became co-regent after returning from Poland, where he had been held as a prisoner. Although he was considered a patriarch, in documents he was called the Great Sovereign. During his reign, Michael began a Europeanization process in Russia, which had a major breakthrough during the reign of Peter the Great. Michael Romanov died on July the 12th, 1645. His successors went on to try to maintain his legacy. In 1689, Peter the Great ascended the throne, regarded as the greatest of the Romanovs. After all, he was 2 meters tall. Crowned as Tsar in 1689, Peter reigned for 36 years. Since childhood, Peter had an interest in Europe. As a teenager, he would run away from the Kremlin to play outside the city with 3 older companions, a Scotsman, a German, and a Swiss. In 1697, he was the first Tsar to leave Russia. He traveled under a pseudonym and spent a year and a half wandering in Western Europe. It was difficult to remain incognito given his stature. In addition, he traveled with an entourage of 250 people, including dwarves and court jesters. His language was Russian, and his manners, well, let's just say they were not particularly polite. When he returned to Russia, Peter ferociously enlarged his empire in the east and in the west. He cut off his long beard, ordered all men to wear a mustache like his, and altered the nobles' robes. He also built Russia's first sea fleet, militarized the empire, and made it a power that haunted the world, especially the dreaded Ottomans. Peter is considered the father of modern Russia. He westernized the empire and built from scratch the most European of Russian cities, St. Petersburg, which was later named Petrograd and Leningrad, regaining its original name after being the Russian capital for 2 centuries. The city was erected off the Neva River on the Baltic Sea in 1703. Planned by European architect and artist, it was built by the slave labor of thousands of Swedish soldiers whom Peter's armies defeated in the Great Battle of the North. Westernization provoked the revolt of his firstborn and heir Alexei, who was accused of treason by his father and died after being the victim of long whippings. The feats were a palliative to ease the permanent tension in Peter's courts. This was the case until his death, caused by gangrene in his bladder, on February the 8th, 1725. Peter was succeeded by his wife, Catherine. Catherine was Peter's second wife, a servant girl with supposed Swedish ancestry. In 1703, Catherine met Peter, who was already married. The two became lovers. Peter and Catherine married secretly around 1707 and had 12 children, but only Anna and Isabel survived to adulthood. The couple had a strong relationship. The emperor officially married her in 1712 and made her empress consort. Peter crowned Catherine as co-regent of the Russian Empire in 1724, and she assumed the throne alone in 1725 after her husband's death, becoming the first woman in history to rule Russia. The new empress was controlled by her advisors for much of her reign, but she single-handedly managed to reduce army spending and ease financial burden on the population. Catherine died in 1727 at the age of 43 from tuberculosis. She was succeeded by Peter II, grandson of Peter the Great. Peter II had a short life, dying at the age of 14. After his demise, the male lineage of the Romanov dynasty ended. The successor was Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Ivan V, half-brother of Peter the Great. Later, another woman ascended the throne, Elizabeth Romanov. She was the daughter of Peter the Great with Catherine I. She came to power after a coup d'etat and ruled for many years. The throne then passed to her weak son Peter III, who lost the crown to his wife, the Germanic Princess Sophia. She is forever in history under the name Catherine the Great. Catherine was another figure who towered over the Romanov dynasty, but she was neither Russian nor Romanov. Catherine was an obscure Germanic princess who married Peter III at the age of 14. They lived together for 18 years, first as friends and then as antagonists, when Peter insulted her in public and started living openly with his mistress. In 1762, a conspiracy was organized in her favor, and Peter was forced to abdicate. Shortly after, he died in a suspicious fight during a dinner party. Since it was never confirmed that Peter III was the father of Catherine's son Paul, it is likely that the original Romanov lineage ended after this quarrel. Catherine's reign added to the classical style of the Russian autocracy. Diderot, Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu were her favorite authors. She exchanged letters with Voltaire and Frederick the Great. She built the beautiful Hermitage Palace as a guesthouse if Voltaire ever wanted to visit Russia, but he never did. Catherine wrote a history of her country, with paintings and sculptures. She never married a second time. She lived alone, getting up at 5 in the morning and working 15 hours a day. Over the years, she had dozens of lovers. Some, like Prince Gregory Potemkin, helped rule Russia. About Potemkin, she wrote that the letters exchanged between the two were almost man-to-man, except that one of them was a very attractive woman. Catherine died in 1796, the year Napoleon Bonaparte won his first military victories in Italy. 16 years later, Napoleon invaded Russia and entered Moscow, where his army was decimated by wind and snow. 2 years later, in 1814, Catherine's grandson, Tsar Alexander I, entered Paris in command of a Russian army. Alexander's successor was his brother, Nicholas I. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, was Nicholas I's great-grandson. But the Romanovs differed from the Habsburgs in that they were not obstinate about maintaining royal lineage within the family. For example, Nicholas II was hardly considered Russian. The Tsars married German and Danish women, which gradually dissipated the Tsar's Russian blood. Tsar Alexander I's victory against Napoleon Bonaparte made Russia a strong military power. At the same time, it concentrated more and more power in the Tsar's hands, as Napoleon's revolutionary wins were not successful in Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Tsar Nicholas I, Alexander II, and Alexander III still had to fight hard against nationalist, liberal, and anarchist movements. Alexander II even tried to make some liberal and modernizing reforms to renew the crystallized Russian society. On February 19, 1861, he decreed the end of serfdom in Russia, a law that had already been abolished throughout Europe. 22.5 million serfs were freed, but the ownership of the landed estates was preserved. Due to the humiliation Russia suffered during the Crimean War, the emperor decided to invest in war resources in 1874. He imposed military conscription and the construction of defense zones. Also, the king followed the French model and implemented new penal and judicial codes, including a court, judges, and juries. The Ministry of the Interior also created rural and municipal security forces. Among his many achievements, the emperor established electoral assemblies to collect taxes in rural localities and then in cities. But Alexander II's modernizing style was not well received. They tried to kill him several times, and he was eventually assassinated in a bombing on March 13, 1881. The assassination of Alexander II had serious consequences for Russia, mainly due to the hardening of the autocracy brought by his son, Tsar Alexander III. The assassination of Alexander II was a setback for the reformist movement. One of the emperor's last ideas was to devise plans for an elected parliament, the Duma, which were completed on the eve of his death. However, they had not been presented to the Russian people. Alexander had planned to reveal his ideas for the creation of the Duma 48 hours after the day of his assassination. Had he lived a little longer, Russia could have followed the path of a constitutional monarchy instead of the long oppression that began after his son's reign. Alexander III's first action after his coronation was to tear up those plans. The Duma was not created until 1905, when Alexander's grandson, Nicholas II, was pressured to establish it after the Russian Revolution of 1905. A second consequence of the assassination was the beginning of pogroms and anti-Jewish legislation. Between 1881 and 1920, about 2 million Jews were expelled from Russia. A third consequence was the suppression of civil liberties in Russia and the return of heavy police repression after some liberalization in the reign of Alexander II. The Tsar's assassination was witnessed in person by his son Alexander III and his grandson Nicholas II. Both subsequently ruled Russia and promised that their fate would not be the same. Both used the Okhrana, the Russian secret police, to arrest Protestants and put down supposed rebel groups, suppressing more personal freedoms of the Russian people. Finally, the assassination inspired the anarchists to promote active propaganda, resorting to major acts of violence to incite revolution. Although he was deeply authoritarian and cautious, Alexander III did not escape assassination attempts. On March 1, 1887, Alexander Ulyanov participated in one of these actions. He was the brother of Vladimir Ulyanov Ilyich, better known as Lenin. The plans of Lenin's brothers' group was unearthed by the Okhrana. He was arrested and hanged. Alexander's death completely altered the life of Vladimir, who until then was a young scholar. Lenin's older brother was very important in his political formation as a revolutionary thinker, and later as the founder of the Soviet Union. Alexander III's reign of persecution and oppression ended on November 1, 1894, when he died only 49 years old. Everyone expected him to live longer, as he was always considered healthy and strong. But his unexpected death led to the young and inexperienced Nicholas II ascending the Russian throne. The last Tsar was Nicholas II, a man unfit to command the empire. He was shy and religious. He believed to the end that his reign was God's design, and made the same mistakes as his predecessors, Nicholas I, Alexander II, and Alexander III. He criticized Peter the Great for believing that the latter had broken Russian traditions. He also ignored the political and social upheavals that had been raging in the empire since the early 19th century, when the winds of the French Revolution swept the world. After Alexander I, who ironically fought a despot to liberate France and Europe, only later to act like one himself, there were several uprisings in the Russian Empire. Endless serfdom, which massacred a miserable population, mainly millions of peasants, in addition to the lack of perception in the face of profound changes, such as liberalism and socialism, and the new industrialized powers, Europe, made Nicholas's reign a chaos. Detached from his empire's reality, the Tsar was dominated by his wife Alexandra, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. He was also influenced by an odd figure, whom he believed to be a divine envoy, but who hastened his downfall, the mystical Siberian peasant, Grigory Rasputin. Until he was assassinated by a prince who wanted to save the monarchy, Rasputin completely controlled the lives of the last Romanovs. Rasputin's power over Nicholas was directly related to the last heir, Alexei, the youngest, who was a hemophiliac and got better after being attended by a mysterious mystic. Reckless, Nicholas even tolerated Rasputin's fornications with court women because he believed he was a God-sent envoy to the court. The last Tsar let his enemies grow up around him, violently suppressing all revolts, including the 1905 sailors' mutiny. In February 1917, he could resist no longer. After bringing Russia into World War I with obsolete armaments relative to the European powers, the court collapsed. Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and other revolutionaries, as well as the peasantry and part of the nobility and court, put an end to the Romanov dynasty. After 16 months of imprisonment in Siberia, Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, young Alexei, and princesses Olga, Maria, Anastasia, and Tatiana were slaughtered by Bolsheviks with gunfire and bayonet blows. The goal was to ensure the elimination of all Romanovs to unlock the rise of communism in Russia, which culminated in the lead-in decades led by a new type of Tsar in the 20th century, Joseph Stalin. At the time, Lenin's government only confirmed the Tsar's death, but Nikolai Sokolov, the white government investigator in Siberia, found evidence that the 11 residents of the Ipativ house had been executed and cremated not far from there. The fate of the bodies remained a mystery until the end of the Soviet Union in 1911. Following the clues left by Sokolov, 9 skeletons found by amateur historians in the 1980s were exhumed from a shallow grave near the execution site. Although almost all current Romanov descendants believe that Russia will not adopt a constitutional monarchy, much less an autocracy as in the time of Nicholas II, there are 5 branches of the family that claim the right to the deposed Tsar's throne. In 2013, the year the Romanov dynasty would have completed 400 years of its rise to power, 48 of Russians stated that they positively assessed Tsar Nicholas II, second only to Lenin and Stalin.